Welcome to the Stoke It Up podcast, a podcast encouraging you in your journey with God. I'm Alan Stoddard. I'm your host, and we are here to kindle afresh the gift of God that is in you. And we want to help you be successful and encouraged in the Great Commission of Jesus Christ, to go into all the world and make disciples, and to do that in everyday life. And today we are starting a two-part series with Dr. Kenneth Priest. He is an expert at revitalization, and so we're excited about it. We will see you on the other side. Let's check it out. Well, all right, everybody. I am here with Dr. Kenneth Priest, my best friend in the ministry, and there's a whole lot to that. You know, Kenneth, actually, he's been getting me jobs for over 20 years now. In some form or fashion, we were graders at Southwestern Seminary together. Just incredible, nuts. This whack story. Kenneth is a revitalization. I call you the best guy in the United States. I know you hate me saying that. And then, you know, there's other people. Well, there's other guys in Mark Clifton. And I mean, he is legend. That dude's so legend. And there's others, but I have seen Kenneth, apart from me just being his brother in the Lord, I have seen the fruit of churches that have been revitalized through his ministry. So guys like me probably talk it and maybe have done it, but Kenneth has been mobilizing multiple churches, mobilizing for church revitalization. He's a graduate of Southwestern Seminary, of course, and Midwestern, got a DMin in revitalization from there. He's been on staff at the SBTC for a long time. And then now he is suffering for the Lord in an interim pastorate in Hawaii. What church are you at there in Hawaii, Kenneth?
Now we're doing the transitional pastorate for Valley Isle Fellowship on Maui.
Oh, man. And you guys have only been there like 2 weeks?
Well, we've been here for a full month, but I've been in the pulpit for 2 weeks. Yes.
Okay. You've been there a month in pulpit. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us here on the Stoke It Up podcast. What we want to do is kindle afresh the gift of God that is in people to help them be successful for Great Commission work. And one of the questions I thought of late last week, and Kenneth was willing to join us real quick. Thank you, Ken. Is that what are the few things that we would look at churches and go, here's the non-negotiables? I mean, these are non-negotiable things that we would go, this church is healthy, it's renewed or revived. And these are real markers beyond philosophy that are real markers to show. Now, the subject is this, how the need to see many Great Commission churches that are healthy and have kingdom desire. And so what I want to do is relate revitalization principles to not just pastors, but I want us, Kenneth, in these next 25 minutes to talk to people in the pew too. I think we got to get them moving with the pastors. So let me give the 6 things that Kenneth gave, and I added one just for discussion. 6 non-negotiables for church revitalization, and I wrote in continual renewal of the church. Number 1, a culture of prayer. Number 2, expectancy of God to move. Number 3, worship geared for evangelism. Number 4, follow-up strategy for all church activities, worship, and events. I read that to a friend of mine last night, and he said, what does that mean? So I said, I'm going to ask him. Number 5, community outreach. Number 6, congregation equipped for evangelism. And then I wrote in number 7, congregation equipped for New Testament disciple making. Yeah. So, Kenneth, welcome to the podcast. Thank you, brother, for joining in. It means a lot. Those are 6 things. Let me jump right out and ask you, what does a culture of prayer look like to you in a church?
Yeah, so in revitalization, of course, you know, we always say the foundation begins with prayer. And I remember listening to you and Dr. Queen last week, and you kind of gave the hey, you know, we're presupposing prayer in our conversation. And so sometimes you have to just outright say it. It's not even just the presupposition. I want you to know you've got to have the culture of prayer. And it's going to look a little different in every church, right? But if you go into a church that prayer is used as a transition to move the worship service, right? So this is when the worship leader prays so the praise team can walk off the stage, right? That's a transition prayer. That's not a culture of prayer, man. That's a program of prayer. A culture of prayer is when the pastor stands up and is like, man, we're just going to go into a season of prayer. I don't know how long it's going to last. It's going to be, might make some of you uncomfortable because we're going to be quiet for a while. And after I, believe it's enough time, I'll say a word of prayer, vocal prayer. So we know that this season is ended, and then the worship service will continue. That's more of the culture of prayer. You're not just programming to let the service move from one element to the next element, but it really is just a time to allow people to prepare their hearts, prepare their minds to prepare for worship. But then even more than that, it's getting the congregation praying, right? And so one of the ways that we do that is doing 40 days of prayer in a new context, so that people that do not have the practice of daily prayer, if you just do these little bite-sized chunks, right? You and I have talked about this for years, just I forgot to pray today. Let me just sit down and do a quick prayer. That's better than nothing, right? And so people that don't have the practice of prayer, you can help guide them. And so it's an individual or a family prayer time, but if the entire congregation is doing it, it's a corporate movement that's taking place. And so adding in that type of thing to help develop the practice of prayer. And then for those people that already have a practice of prayer, they join the corporate praying through this individual prayer time, and they just add it on to what they're already doing in their quiet time, their devotion, so that it gets the entire church focused and praying on the same things for the same purpose during the same season. And so it's not everybody just wanting to pray for whatever they want to pray, but it's really a guided prayer time. And that really creates the right culture for prayer. So those are just a couple of the elements that I see that are necessary in order to have the appropriate foundation for prayer. If those things are happening, now there's other prayer, we're doing a Monday night prayer meeting. This is what the church has done for years. Of course, because COVID, they were online. Well, this week we actually start back in person. And so just finding those opportunities, that those that are, moving forward in their disciple making journey could engage in additional prayer times together. And so doing the in-person prayer services are a great way to do that. So those are just a few of the elements that begin to create the culture of prayer. But again, it can't be a program for it. It's got to create the culture for it. So even when you're doing the in-person prayer services, just sitting down, the old traditional, let's break out the prayer list and we're just going to pray through it. And, okay, well, it was short this week, so now the pastor's going to do a little devotion and then walk away. That's not what we're talking about. It's really just allowing the people to come together and pray. And you don't really worry about the prayer list. These are all the people that submitted the prayer request. So those prayers are going to come out as a part of the prayer meeting anyway. So you don't have to read through a prayer list. You just begin praying and let the people pray. And then from that, God does the work that God does.
I remember when John Franklin came out with a book called And the Place Was Shaken. Mm-hmm. And that book helped put together how to lead a prayer meeting that involved worship and music. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. And then I will also put a link to an article that Kai Bowman wrote. I'm going to interview him and Trey Kent, I hope, because God has been doing some amazing prayer things in Austin. And he wrote about how to lead prayer meetings and all of that. What I hear you saying is, I heard the combination between there's got to be corporate and individual. And there's got to be enough that it's not just, okay, who's going to pray so we can show people from the stage that we're praying, but we're really don't look like it's a culture of prayer where it's natural. I would say that I watched y'all's first service there in Hawaii. When you did that prayer thing at the beginning of the service, that was different. I don't even go to that church. I thought that's different, but I liked it because it wasn't long. It wasn't weird. It was out. It was different because it was at the beginning of the service and people were called forward to just pray for the service. I thought, wow, that's a thought. That was great. And then I would add this. One of the markers to have a culture of prayer, if we're going to see renewal and revitalization, you got to have a prayer leader in your church. You have to have somebody that organizes and leads the prayer meetings. The pastor must be a part of it, but you could actually find somebody that you say, would you please own leading the prayer meetings and putting them together and maybe planning with the worship team. What do you think about that? Am I on track?
That's so in revitalization, there's no leaders doing anything. So if anything's to start, the pastor has to start it. But that gets into the disciple making side. What we tell pastors is, look, you've got to get this up and rolling, but then you find that key leader that you can disciple to take over this ministry, and then you put it in their hands and let them start running it. You still support it. Like you're saying, pastor still shows up. You still support it. Now, it might take you 3, 6, 12 months to find that person. And so in revitalization, the pastor has to do a lot of different work to tee things up and get them going, and training and discipling the people to take over. But yeah, ultimately, you want to hand this off to someone else so that they're coordinating and they're telling you as the pastor, here's your part. This is what I want you to do. And you show up and you do your part as the pastor.
So if we're marking revitalized, healthy, Great Commission churches, either on the way to that or that are there now, what we are saying in this podcast, at least, is that you ought to have a culture of prayer. And there's some markers that you need to have. You need to have a prayer leader. You need to not just pray in public, but there needs to be a natural outflow. I look for a prayer meeting at a church. I want to know where is the prayer meeting. I don't care how many people come to it. Then there's the mobilization of prayer.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a church member listening, let me throw in the shoe leather principle right here. If you're a church member and you're attending your church, we would ask you, then why don't you go ahead and stoke up some praying in your church? Why don't you pray about who would be that leader? Or maybe God's going to lead you to do it, but why don't you go before the service starts? Why don't you go and just tell the pastor you're praying for the team? Or if enough of us started doing that, this culture of prayer will take off. I've seen that happen. So
that's right.
Ask yourself, not just the pastor, but church members, jump in and help us create this culture of prayer.
That's right.
Okay. Number 2 is this: expecting God to move. There's an expectancy of God to move. What do you mean by this, Kenneth?
Yeah, so this is to me, it's a biblical principle. It comes out of the church at Pentecost. You go back to Acts 1 and 2, and you look at what was taking place. And when Jesus ascends, he tells the disciples to go and wait for the Comforter, right? To go and wait for the Comforter. And you look at those days, those 10 days that they're waiting for the Comforter. I preach a sermon on this, and it kind of tell the story. Don't you think on the third day they actually were expecting the Holy Spirit to come? Because it was on the third day that Jesus was raised from the dead, right? The greatest miracle of all time happened on the third day.
That's good.
And so they're sitting there in their room and they're praying, and they're like, okay, Lord, it's the third day. It's going to happen now. And it doesn't happen. And so it kind of wanes on for multiple days. And don't you think they were kind of sitting there going, well, when's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? So now they're not anticipating, they're expecting, right? They were anticipating the third day. Now they're expecting, and they don't know when God's going to do it. It went past the day that they thought. So now when is it going to happen? So they're just praying and expecting God is going to do this. God is going to do this. And on the 10th day, right, that's when it happens. And so, that's the culture of expectancy that should be happening. Do people come to church expecting God to move? And ask the question of the pastor and ask the question of the congregation. Many pastors step in the pulpit to preach a sermon, and they do not expect God to move through their sermon. They've never prayed for it. They've never asked for it. They don't expect God's movement. They just want God to bless their sermon, right? God will bless his word, but when you're expecting God to move, it's a formula, but it is a reality. God moves in the hearts of the expectant believers. And so when our church unites in expectancy, then is when we see God begin to move. And so if we have the foundation of prayer, we're all praying, we got our culture of prayer. Now we can move into this issue of expectancy. We're coming to worship, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen every Sunday. It may not happen the first, second, or third week, but the Spirit didn't come on the third day, right? They wanted it to, but it didn't. He came on the 10th day. It was after continued expectant hearts were waiting on him. He finally revealed himself in flames of fire, right? The tongues of fire that surrounded them. So That's the whole concept of expectancy. We need to go to church on a continual basis, praying and expecting God to move in our midst. And one day, God will.
I can remember Dr. Hempel saying this in some book. I can't remember which one of his books, but he talked about the need for prayer because it is what moves the change and brings the change that a church needs, or keeps a church on center mass with God there. And I can remember praying and saying, Lord, would you bring these kind of people to our church? And when I prayed it in the prayer room, in the prayer meeting, I remember going, this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen at this church. What are you praying for? And it did happen. It happened in mass. And I thought, wow, I've been lowballing the Lord. I've had a lack of expectancy. So let's do this. Maybe one of the shoe leather things that all of us as Christians can do is if you're having trouble getting unchurched people to your church, it's not, Dr. Hempel would say this, it's not your strategies first. It's your praying first. We have to ask the Lord to get involved and expect that he's going to do something. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and that's, the whole concept of the current, I'm Baptist, so the current Southern Baptist movement for the past couple of years, the Johnny Hunt, who's your one, right? It begins with praying for your one. If you want them to show up, it's an old Operation Andrew principle from the Billy Graham Crusades, right? You list out the 10 people that you want to invite to the crusade, and for months you pray that they will show up to the crusade when you invite them, and then you go invite them. Us expecting somebody to show up at church without us doing the invitation, why would they show up to church? We need to pray for them. Then we can invite them after we've spent a season praying for them and see what God does.
Amen. All right. Number one is a culture of prayer. Number two, have an expectancy of God to move. If your church is going to look like it's revitalized and on mission with God, those are two things. Here's number three. Worship service is geared for evangelism. What does that look like? What do you mean by that?
Well, the simple answer is the gospel has got to be presented, but even when the gospel is presented, an invitation has got to be extended, right? There's plenty of guys that preach good, solid biblical sermons, and they never tell anybody what to do with it. But to go deeper than that, if the entire service, if the worship service is geared for evangelism, then it's not just what happens at the end of the service, but it's how everything is working together. Whether you a fan of the church growth movement, of seeker sensitive, all these words that are out there, there are certain realities of what happened through the late 80s into the 90s, 2000s. And it was an evangelistic emphasis for the worship service. They geared the services for the invitation to get to a point to invite people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, for those that are cynics or critics of the church growth movement, I'm not. I don't have any problems with it. But those that are, they do the pendulum reaction, right? Well, we don't want to do anything that they used to do, so we do all of this. And in doing all of this on the opposite side, we're not making evangelistic worship services. And so the service is not geared to lead toward a decision. The service is simply geared to communicate content, biblical content. And there's nothing wrong with biblical content, but biblical content should lead to an invitation. It should lead to someone being challenged and confronted with the truth of the gospel, the truth of the good news of Jesus Christ, and therefore an invitation must be extended. Now, likewise, if you preach good biblical content and then all you do is an invitation, you've missed out as well, because you've not transferred the biblical content to why that matters to me today. And that question, and that's a great question that you can add on to a conversation with Matt Queen when they say, okay, he and O.S. Hawkins are writing this book on the gospel invitation. Well, let's make sure that we're asking the question, how do we move from biblical content to invitation? What's that bridge, right? What moves me from saying, thus saith the Lord, and here's why it matters today. right? This is why it's
Right.
relevant for your life. If we don't do that, then people that are unchurched, they hear this biblical content and they go, it's antiquated and out of date. It has no relevance in my life today. And you've not shown me relevance for my life today, but yet you've asked me to respond and you've not given me a reason to respond. So that's what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about worship services are geared evangelistically, everything is connected and you're trying to bridge that gap from biblical content to why is this relevant? Now, would you be willing to make a decision for Jesus?
That's awesome. Matt Queen dealt with some of that and how to do an invitation. I think that's a whole podcast by itself.
Definitely.
But there's the evangelistic side, and then there's in the Calvary movement, I've noticed that there's a ministry approach to it. So in other words, if you want to come forward for prayer and just you have something you want to pray about, that goes back up to prayer. There's a moment where they do prayer and the music is pretty quiet or non-existent, and you can just come up and they have pastors up front who will pray with you and other leaders who will pray with you. Worship geared for evangelism. The invitation, I would add in the way you welcome people is important. You don't want it to be concocted. Let it be natural. And I would add this. Don't leave the room when the altar call is given. I would just say, don't do that. And there's a lot of different ways to do the altar call. No problem. I don't care about the methods. Just do it. James Merritt sends them out the back. Other people call them forward. Some people use cards or text, or now it's a scan. You can scan something and it'll let you record the decision. But don't leave the room. I would say it's disheartening to your pastor if you walk out during the last song and there's all this movement when your pastor is trying to gear the sermon for the most incredible moment of a person's life. So if you're listening, and also if you're listening, here's another shoe leather thing. Pray for the invitation during the sermon.
That's right.
Let me try with the time we got left to get at least one more question in, and we may have to do a follow-up on some of these, which will be cool. Number 4 is follow-up strategy for all church activities, worship, and events. These are things that we are outlining here, and they'll be in the show notes, that we are saying that if you don't have, really what we're implying, to be nice in a pretty rough way, if you don't have these things, you're not revitalizing, you're not aligned up with God, and you need to make the shifts to make this happen. So what is that, Kenneth? Follow-up strategy for all church activities and worship and events.
Yeah, so there are churches all over the place that they hold an event and they never collect information on their attendees, right? And so you don't know who was there, who participated. And so there's no basis for doing follow-up. These are, in revitalization context, the thing I hear all the time is, well, we don't have any prospects. Well, how are you collecting information, right? If you do a men's event, a women's event, a vacation Bible school, kids, what are you actually registering people? And then what do you do with that information? I've worked with churches before that they get all this information and they just kind of stick it in a file and set it to the side. They never do anything with it. And I've heard guys say, well, they didn't actually attend a worship service, therefore I don't need to follow up with them. That's encroaching on their personal. Look, if somebody gives you their information, they're opening a door for you to contact them. And so any event that you have should have a data collection of some kind, text message, email, address, whatever. A worship service, now to turn off the spiritual side and turn on the marketing side, every Sunday is an event, right? Every Sunday is a worship service. And so collecting that information and then responding appropriately to those people. I hear from churches in communities all the time. So we'll go out, right? So I've heard from people in Utah, right? Well, we don't do door-to-door visitation because that's what the Mormons do, and they'll equate us with being the Mormons. And so we don't do that. Well, one of the fastest growing churches in Salt Lake City does door-to-door visitation, right? They're like, look, man, if somebody visits our church, we go knock on their door. If somebody moves in the community, we go knock on their door. We're aggressively presenting the gospel. And guess what? It's paying off for that church. I hear all over the nation people say, "Oh, door to door doesn't work," and yet door to door does work, right? You know all the stories of the guys that are being successful doing this, planting churches by going and knocking on doors. So there's got to be a follow-up strategy for everything you do, and it needs to be a strategy. It's not just oh, I got this information, I'll get around to it, right? No, you need to immediately respond as quickly as you can. The first 24, 48 hours, send a text, send an email, go make a personal visit. Personal visits are always the most effective. We know that. But, even if you're got this personality flaw that doesn't let you go knock on the door, send a text message, send an email, let the people know you care, let them know that you recognize their attendance. You're here for them. Your church is here for them. You want to be a resource to them. There are prospects in every community because there's lost people all over the place. It's just a matter of, are you connecting with them? So the follow-up strategy really, and again, we can kind of go all the way back. Your follow-up strategy begins with prayer as well. Begins with praying that God will bring people. Then it's praying that the people will be receptive, right? And then praying before you go visit with them, or pray before you send the text message or the email. Lord, let them be receptive to my reaching out to them. So we've got to be in the business of making connections. I mean, that's what a follow-up strategy is all about. It's about making connections. The church is supposed to connect with people in the community.
I'll tell you the biggest one for me, and that's a big amen. We need to do a series of podcasts on each one of these by itself with a bunch of preparation. But the biggest way for me to follow up is I would text people and say, can I buy you coffee or a latte? And I'm going to go spend $5 or $6 to buy them a latte. I don't care, because most of the time, not all, but most of the time, the people that I can get there and say this, hey, what's your story? And just sit there and listen. And then I don't even barely have to sell the church, because most of the time we're not asking people that. We're so rushed. The people that I can get to that and follow up, they usually come back, and they'll usually stick in some kind of way. They may not join the church, or they may not be there all the time, but they'll remember the pastor, or if you're a leader, to give you, if you're a member of a church, to give you a shoe leather example. Hey, why don't you go to your pastor and say, Pastor, who was a guest last week that I could text and say, hey, can I buy you coffee? And just go listen to their story and say, hey, I'm Alan. I'm from so-and-so church, and I'm just glad you're here. I heard you were here. I saw you fill out a card, and I just wanted to, and sometimes I'll take a guest gift and give it to them there. As something small, simple. It just shows hospitality.
That's right. That's good.
Because not everybody's a door-to-door person. I know that. I did last week with Stonewater here in Granbury, but not everybody's that. That doesn't have to be, that's not the only way. The deal is to do follow-up.
That's right.
To do it. Do and expect. That's good stuff. All right, we got time for one more question. And then the other two we will save for a follow-up. Community outreach. What are your top 3 examples of community outreach today, Kenneth, that are working in churches? Community outreach.
Well, the depends on how you label things, right? So to me, community outreach, I put Vacation Bible School as part of that. Is still the number one. All these churches that say, oh, we don't do Vacation Bible School anymore. Now, look, you don't have to do the literal Vacation Bible School where you buy a kit from, but are you doing some type of summer, weekday program, whether in the mornings or the evenings, whether it's a sports camp or a Bible study, backyard Bible club, you're doing something that, whether it's on your church campus or out in people's homes, that connects with your community for a specific and explicit purpose to engage them as representatives of your church, right? So number one, community outreach for me is a Vacation Bible School type of experience, engaging with those young families and connecting with them. Additional community outreach effective tools centers around meeting the needs of the community. And so you can't just say, hey, hey, we're going to do this men's event. We're going to do this wild game dinner. If you're sitting in the middle of, we'll use Granbury, man. I was on staff down there for 18 months. You know, wild game dinner may not work in Granbury, but a fish fry does work in Granbury because it's on the lake and all these guys are fishermen. And so you do a men's fish fry, the guys come out for it. And, you know, especially if you say, hey guys, it's going to be an all day event that ends with a fish fry, you go catch and then we'll cook. Right. So all those fishermen go out on their boats and then they show up at the landing and you go do a big fish fry. And oh, while you've got them there, you know, you do a message, an evangelistic message. And so you find out the needs of the community. You look at your community. When we were actually in Granbury, there were, if I remember correctly, there were 11 youth during the 18 months we were down there that died tragic deaths. Right.
Wow.
Drownings in the lake, DUI crash, you know, these types of things. I mean, over the course of just it was a lot. And so the community need was a place to grieve, but also a parent forum would have been great there to talk to parents about these things. What can we do to elevate the risk and help teenagers understand better? So you got to find what the need in the community is and address that need. If you're dealing with an impoverished group, then, you know, offering financial planning, offering what is that organization, the Day of Hope, right, where they come in and they do the medical clinics and they give away bags of groceries. And so you find the need that your community has and you organize your community outreach around that need in order to connect better with the community.
We used to do free car washes at the church.
Right.
And I actually have a guy that I led to the Lord because of that. He's a great friend. I've discipled him some. And then Tim, you know, Tim, he's discipling one-on-one right now. And
that's great.
Free car washes. And so we're saying a couple of things. And now if you're listening, before we land the plane here for this session, this is definitely a part 2, is that you can be the person that says, hey, you know what? I'm going to organize some of the people in the church. Let's do a free car wash. Or you could go, how are we doing? We're not doing a vacation Bible school or a backyard Bible club approach to anything. And maybe your church needs to do it. You know, we were in a church in Ruidoso where the campus was so small for something like that. But you know what? I think we use that as an excuse. We just didn't take enough initiative to go for it and maybe limit the amount of families you can handle, but to do something.
Yeah. Well, you can do micro groups in people's yards. And so you go to these different subdivisions, you bring in one bounce house and you say, hey, we're going to do a micro Bible study on this day at this location. And you set up and then you go to another house in another subdivision on another day and do the exact same thing. And so there's creative ways of engaging the families if the families are there. Now, what you don't want to do, so I did work with one church in revitalization that there were no kids left in the community, right? It was a dying community. There was only a few hundred farmers left and they're all older senior adults. Man, if we tried to do a vacation Bible school at that church, that would have been the dumbest spending of money ever because there are no kids there, right? But there were adults there that had needs. And so we would have gone in to find out what are their needs. And that, you know, that was my encouragement to the church. Just that when I got there, this is, you know, we're out of time, but I'll just tell the quick story that, you know, when I got there, the Sunday I showed up to meet with this church, they introduced me to their youth pastor that they had just voted on that day. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, there are no youth in this community. And they're like, yeah, but we thought he would be able to draw them in from the next county over. And I'm like, they're not going to come over from the next county. They've got 3 churches to go to in that county. Parents are not going to send their kids all the way over here. It's a waste of money. It's poor stewardship. So know the community context in order to do the community outreach. Know who you've got, know what you've got, and then you can go after them.
Well, amen. Thank you, Dr. Kenneth Priest. We have identified 5 of the 7 things that we are calling non-negotiables for church revitalization and continual renewal: a culture of prayer, expectancy of God to move, worship geared for evangelism, follow-up strategy for all church activities and worship events, and then a community strategy for outreach. Now, here's what we'll do. The last two, you're going to have to give me time somewhere else in your calendar here within a week or so. And we'll do a part 2 to this because these last two are bigger than the ones we've gone through already. They deal with equipping for evangelism and equipping to make disciples. I really want to talk about that. I may get you to, well, you know how I'm jumping in anyway, but I may get you to kind of interview me on that. It's a huge need. It's a big need. But for this week, if you're listening, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you so much. I hope you'll take some of these shoe leather things that we tried to point out and get this stuff moving in your local church. Kenneth, any final words?
Hey, man,
you gotta go.
I gotta go, but just before, take these principles and stoke it up.
Amen, dude. Amen. All right. Thanks for being with us. We love you, man.
Love you too.
I hope you enjoyed that part of the interview. You're going to want to get in on part number 2, where we took about 40 minutes to answer 2 questions that we mentioned. Number 1, how do we equip for evangelism? And number 2, how do we equip for disciple making? That'll be coming out in a few days after this launch, but I hope you'll subscribe to the YouTube channel. I hope that you'll subscribe in Apple Podcast and the Play Store. And just thank you for your support. If you would like to partner with us, reach out to me. I'll give you more information. We love you guys. If we can help you in your journey with God, you count us in. We will see you in the next episode.